Okay.
All right.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's panel on violence in Ithaca and American society, sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. I am Ken Clarke, director of the office. Today's broadcast will live after the day on the Tompkins County YouTube channel, which will enable you to watch it again and allow others unable to attend this live event to access it. Recently, there have been reported upticks in violent incidents in Ithaca and across the country. Locally, attention has been given to increased incidents of shots fired and physical attacks. WENY News stated that gun violence in 2020 was over 2.5 times higher than in 2018. Documented robberies rose from 9 in 2019 to 33 in 2020. Some believe, with good reason, the economic adversity and social destabilization created by the pandemic may be a significant contributing factor. Nationally, according to The Atlantic, death by guns reached their highest level in U.S. history in 2020. Mass shootings remain a tragic feature in American life. The rising tide in crime has been compared to the period that preceded it. The relative decline in overall crime and violent crime, particularly from the 1990s until recently. Yet sociologist Patrick Sharkey describes that period by the title of his 2018 book, Uneasy Peace. It was an uneasy peace because that era revealed more than ever the tensions between communities of color and law enforcement, and the violence endured by these communities at law enforcement's hands that gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. Today, I've asked our panel to provide some perspective regarding violence in Ithaca and America. They will analyze perceptions and realities of local and national crime and discuss the way crime is reported by local and national media. They will also unpack anecdotal, social, and journalistic narratives about violence. I'm glad to be joined today by Travis Brooks, Deputy Director of GAC, the Greater Ithaca Activities Center, Professor Sabrina Karim from the Government Department at Cornell, Richard Rivera, who will be joining us shortly, of the local OHR agency, Opportunities, Alternatives, and Resources, and the Ultimate Reentry Program, and Professor Rama Ruzi Ahmad, Director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College. Mr. Brooks will lead off with his remarks, followed by Professor Karim, Mr. Rivera, and Professor Ahmad.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Travis Brooks. And for me, my biggest focus is what goes on in the Ithaca community with our young people as it relates to violence. We know that there's an uptick due to the pandemic. We know there's an uptick for other reasons. Some people will say that because of some of the systemic issues, because of racism and equity, that this leads to some of this behavior. When I'm talking to teenagers, when I'm talking to people under 25, most of our young people are not involved in this type of behavior. It's a handful of folks. And, I think one of the dangers of what we see happening is we make these statements, these blanket statements about our young people. Most of our young people are amazing citizens in this community. Most of them are not engaged or involved in this type of behavior. And so, please don't assume that this is a crisis for our young people in this community. There's some young people that are struggling. Some of them are struggling with mental health. Some of them are struggling with addiction and other issues that lead to some of this behavior. And, we're working with a group of people to help curb it, to have open and honest conversations with those we know that are involved with it. We are looking at, still creating and developing programs to keep others in the future away from it. But, where we were 20, 30 years ago in this community and where we are now with our young people, I think our young people are aspiring to do other things in life. And so, we have an increase of shots fired. We have an increase of guns in the street. There is an increase of music and social issues that really make it seem like this is the behavior for some young people that we're supposed to be engaging in. So we're trying to combat some of that, and it's a work in progress.
Okay. Thank you, Travis. Professor Karim.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for organizing this event. I think it's a very important discussion to have, and it's an honor to be on this panel with my lovely co-panelists. So my name is Sabrina Karim, and I'm an assistant professor in the government department, and I teach an undergraduate class on political violence. And so what I wanted to do is kind of take what Travis has said and his observations about the community, and really, I agree with 100%, and kind of contextualize them in trying to understand and put a framework to why we see violence in general. And you'll note that the class that I teach is called political violence. And so one of the questions that I ask my students is all violence political or not? And in this case, in order to understand criminal violence, right, and at a first glance, you may not think that criminal violence, or what we think of as crime, is political. But if we take a step back and kind of provide some kind of a framework, we can understand that indeed it might be. And there's kind of two ways that I want to kind of describe this today. So the first is talking about this idea of structural violence. And then second, I'll get to what we think of more commonly as political violence, and how, while we shift the focus to crime, we kind of take away our focus on the political violence that is happening in our country. So I'll get to that in a second. So what is structural violence? Structural violence refers to the systemic ways in which social structures harm or otherwise disadvantage individuals. It's a subtle or invisible, and often has no one specific person who can be held responsible, unlike in criminal violence, which is also sometimes considered behavioral. So examples of structural violence are things like racism, elitism, sexism, ethnocentrism, adultism, even. So, privileging adults, for example, over children, like what Travis was saying. And I think when you think of these kinds of structural structures that exist, racism, sexism, et cetera, it's pretty easy to see the connection to violence. So just to give an example, children or youth that lack the same kind of resources due to systemic racism, right, have less opportunities for jobs, which then as they get older, they have less access to healthcare and legal protections, safe housing, et cetera, which makes them more likely to develop diseases and die earlier. Right? That's kind of how we think of a structural violence happening. But what's really interesting is that structural violence not only works systemically in that way, but it also has these kind of ripple effects that can actually lead to what we think of as criminal violence. So I'll just give two examples. The first example is outside of the US. Well, it's related to the US, but it's about the systemic kind of problems with being discriminatory towards immigrants. And the example that I have is actually one of El Salvador. And this is one of my favorite examples with my students, because it kind of really awakens people's ideas about how the policies that we make really have downstream consequences. So in the 1990s, there was a civil war in El Salvador, which led to a massive amount of asylum seekers and refugees who came into the United States. And at that time, the US had welcomed them in essence. But then there was a big crackdown on the immigrants that came during that time, in the later of the 1990s and into 2000s, where there were over 300,000 immigrants who were deported from El Salvador. Right, so these are adults and children who had come here fleeing a civil war. They mostly lived in California, but all throughout the U.S. Some of them did get involved in some what we consider criminal activities, and that was the basis for the deportation. is that these instances of a few people engaging in criminal activity led to this mass deportation. What ended up happening, though, is that those members who were a part of the gangs here in the US, then were able to, when they got to El Salvador, actually strengthen the gang activity in El Salvador through the development of one of the most violent gangs that stands out, or that I think that we know about, or that has been kind of portrayed in the media, the Mara Salvatrucha gang, MS-13. And because of the deportation and because of discrimination of immigrants, it allowed the gang to grow and expand and create one of the highest murder rates in El Salvador that the country is able to see, right? And now we're still seeing the ripple effects of that violence here in the US with now, in the last few years, more immigrants coming from El Salvador and Central America as a result of the spread of that violence. So that's just one example of how a single policy that is discriminatory, could be discriminatory, right, can have ripple effects. The other example is mass incarceration. So we can think of mass incarceration or incarceration as the policy solution to crime, but there's a lot of structural violence that's involved with mass incarceration. But even despite that, it actually has this negative effect of enhancing or strengthening gang activity. For example, it's pretty obvious if you think about it. If you take all of the gang members who are in, or would-be gang members or supposed gang members and put them into prison, you've essentially created a safe space for certain people to organize within the prison system, right? So it essentially leads to centralization and the consolidation of power of certain actually violent people. It allows them to recruit more members, and it allows the spread of gang activity because prison inmates move around to different prisons, et cetera. And when you take away and mass incarcerate, that leaves open space in the neighborhoods or in society as well for other gangs to flourish. So you basically have created a situation where you could worsen criminal activity, in quotes, right, by mass incarcerating folks. So these are two examples of how structural violence can actually lead to criminal violence, even though I don't think there's necessarily a distinction between the two. But the last thing I'll say is about political violence more broadly, or what we think of as violence by political groups as opposed to for individual or personal gain. It's interesting to me that we've, as a society, and really kind of even in the media or at the national level, developed this kind of amnesia about what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. It was really unprecedented. And it wasn't an isolated incident. So you've seen the rise of white nationalism and what really is white terrorism, increasing over the last 5 years. And to the point where now the FBI does say that this is one of the the largest terrorist threat domestically in the US right now. And so what I think we should be really thinking about is not really focusing on the crime rates, and that's what's dominating the media right now, but really stepping back and thinking about violence more broadly, both structural violence and the political violence that our country is seeing, because it's all related. So I'll just leave it there. I'm happy to answer more questions about why we might see this increase in white nationalist terrorism or political violence in the question and answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabrina. Richard? Oh, turn your mic on.
I want to apologize for being late. I was running around kind of crazy, but I'm here and I'm ready. All right, so I wouldn't this presentation to follow a certain trajectory. I want to start with the idea of violence and how in America, for example, in America in particular, how violence is racialized. It has these racial components that when we talk about violence, we use terms like inner city, gangs, Chicago, Detroit, New York, that tend to have a predominantly Black population or Black and brown population in the inner cities. And it sort of creates the image in people's minds that the crimes, the violence, when we see an uptick of violence, that is being committed by Black youth, Black and brown youth. And this idea has been playing throughout history in America. And we could cite cases like Willie Horton, the Central Park Five, or just most recently a shooting in New York City in which this individual was firing a gun at a person who was surrounded by children. Luckily, none of the children got hurt. The perception of Black and brown boys also as tending to be more matured and more violent has been well researched and documented. And because we have this perception of Black and brown people to act in this way, to be more matured and to be more violent. And those perceptions play on how we perceive violence in America. And when we see these upticks of violence, we tend to think Black and brown bodies are committing these crimes and they're the most heinous. Professor Karim pointed out about the gangs. But it's not only your gangs, it's when you say terms like inner city, when you say terms like impoverished areas, these are the places that we are relegated to. And because we're relegated to these places, we tend to be painted as being more violent. And this feeds into the idea, and we're seeing the return of it now because of this most recent uptick, that we must get tough on crime, that we must incarcerate ourselves out of these violent upticks. And what ends up happening, they start creating this rhetoric that that individuals, that our communities are actually involved in the idea that they want to incarcerate more Black and brown bodies. And it's the return to this tough on crime philosophy that led to mass incarceration in the first place. Professor Karim also spoke about the idea of violence, and I like to cite Frantz Fanon's idea on the wretched of the earth, in which he talks about how people who are oppressed and have violence perpetrated on them internalize this violence. That this violence doesn't come out of nowhere, but it comes out of a history of systemic racism. And it is perceived that Black and brown bodies are violent is because this violence has been perpetrated on us. And in that sense, violence does have a political a meaning to it. It has a political, a way of inserting ourselves politically into the discourse, because we're presenting ourselves the way they formed us. Right now, we hear, especially in the news media, the idea that there is an uptick of crime and there is a crime in these communities and we must police our ways out of it. And the news media keeps perpetuating the idea, but when we look at the actual numbers, violent crime is at a lower than what it was in the 70s and 80s. It's just that there's an uptick in crime. And in Ithaca, for example, we have had several incidents recently, especially in the Commons in South Hill. An individual was stabbed in the Commons. There was a shooting in South Hill, and it has Ithaca at an uproar. All the reforms and all the changes that we have been advocating for in the past several years are now thrown out the window, and the idea that policing must be refunded and hiring more officers and must be more aggressive in fighting crime are being spoken about in the Commons. It's being spoken about at Gimme Coffee and all the places where people congregate, because there is this perceived fear that violence is coming to Ithaca and that it is in Ithaca. And what happens is that the whole South Side, the whole West Village, the whole North Side, places where Black and brown people tend to live and congregate, are being perceived as the most violent areas. Professor Margulies does an interesting study out of Cornell. And he says that when there is an uptick of violence in a community, it's generally a few individuals acting out. So you got 4 or 5 people acting out in the community, and each of them are committing 3 or 4 crimes a day. And it multiplies crime by 4-fold, 5-fold. And we see an uptick in the community, but it's not the whole community. It's just a few individuals, a few bad actors in the communities. And when these individuals are removed, we immediately see that crime decreases. And we try to find explanation for them. And we say that policing did better, or that these people aged out, or that we locked them all up. And that's not the truth. The truth is that there was a few bad actors in the community, and when they were apprehended, or when they moved out, or when they were incarcerated, crime goes down. And that is what's happening, I believe, in Tompkins County right now. I work in the community. I work among the most impoverished populations. I hang out on the West Side. I hang out in the homeless encampments. And the uptick on crime that we see now is just a few bad actors, like Dr. Maguli's proposes. And that is what's happening here now. But the idea is that when there is an uptick on crime, whole communities are painted as bad, when it is not the whole community. We're coming out of the pandemic right now. There's a lot of poverty in the area. There's a lot of unresolved issues. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of conflict. And there are new individuals moving into our community, which are making it bad. And that is the cause of it. We do have gang problems in Ithaca, like everywhere else, and we should resolve those problems. What solutions do we have? We don't know yet. We don't know yet because we haven't sat down and spoken to these individuals. We keep thinking of ideas that if we open up more recreational centers, if we do more outreach, if we use ex-gang members to help people get out of gangs and stuff like that, that will work. I believe that the idea would be to listen to these individuals, start a discussion with them, to listen to their narratives. Why are they acting out? What's happening? You know what I mean? And try to find solutions with their participation. So I'll save the rest for question and answers session. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Now, Professor Ahmad.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really, I'll try and bring in some of the themes raised by the panelists. I'm going to focus a little more on the national, side of things, and how media narratives generally display and talk about violence and its various manifestations. I want to start with last year, which has been an extraordinary year, after the murder of George Floyd. And in the weeks that followed, mainstream outlets, media outlets deflected the blame for police violence away from militarized law enforcement, especially by using vague assertions and the passive voice in headlines. FAIR, a media watchdog group, fixed a handful of such headlines from New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, and more by saying Floyd's death in custody. And they said, well, that's a wrong headline. You need to be more direct and truthful by saying police killing of George Floyd. Or as does tear gas pepper balls used on Denver crowd by saying that they should be changed to police use tear gas, police perpetuate violence. Corporate media outlets have journalists and writers capable of identifying agencies and the detail, especially considering only a few keystrokes prepare these headlines to read as though they were journalism. It shows then that the mainstream media outlets default to subtly exempting police from accountability. FAIR.org, the media watchdog group, also tackled many other headlines through the year by pointing out the euphemisms for police. I quote, the police beating the shit out of people, unquote. NBC and CNN repeatedly described rubber-coated bullets, baton beatdowns, and tear gas as aggressive tactics. And many other outlets called fights between unarmed protests and armored police as clashes. So as protests persisted for weeks and months last year, more and more media coverage and media bias became even more apparent on how this entire issue was being framed. So for example, right after the protests, I think a week later, the municipal governments across the country started enacting curfews to suppress protests. Mainstream media framed this decision made by wary governors acting in the public interest to lessen nightly violence. During these protests, mainstream outlets like the Washington Post and NBC welcomed governors' decisions to instate curfews, ignoring the pleas of grieving protesters entirely to foreground government and police. The Times, for example, interviewed current and former police officers, including Bill Bratton, an architect of stop and frisk policy, without offering much insight into the context of racial justice protests. And that is what, earlier Professor Karim was mentioning about the underlying causes of structural violence and structural racism. And that is where media fails, because it fails to sort of highlight the protesters' reason for occupying the streets, denying the necessity of anti-racist demonstrations to alter an ingrained history of racial subjugation, but also ignores outrageous barbarism. And now copious video evidence exists on social media of unprompted police violence. Police brutalize people standing, arms raised or kneeling, with nightsticks, pepper spray, and tear gas, and with disproportionate brutality. One Twitter user last year, I think Chad Loder, compiled a massive thread of nearly 200 instances of police violence right after the murder of George Floyd. And later in June of last year, police, for example, equipped in somewhere, I forget the place, but police with riot gear beat and pepper sprayed a gathering of people attending an outdoor violent concert honoring Elijah McClain. And the mainstream, last summer also, mainstream news took its time sort of catching up to the reality of what was going on, but again snapped in their commitment to both sidism on last June, when police and military under federal orders stormed protesters outside the White House with tear gas and batons to make way for former President Trump's photo op by a church. The Salon compiled accounts of journalists from Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, and other corporate outlets adopting direct language and eschewing the passive voice to call out the brutal and authoritarian act. But these instances are short-lived. For example, at that last year, we had the direct sort of applause by the former president to brutal police tactics, and many people in that administration were kind of encouraging that. So, for example, and in that whole process, even the independent reporters and independent media were suppressed. Attorney Doucette and mathematician Jason Miller created a Google Doc spreadsheet last year that listed thousands of entries where the media were being stopped or attacked, and the Freedom of Press Foundation counted more than 500 press freedom incidents only in last year, and they keep on increasing. Social media has tried to kind of change that landscape for reporting on police violence as well as anti-racist protests, but social media is also employed for fake news and for disinformation, and even by the police. For example, in Chicago, where reports were detailing how the police were savaging protesters, the department's internet presence was displaying these kind of happy images where police officers were walking side by side with protesters. And the White House, disseminated also similar propaganda, as they say now, where police kindness and acts are shown and highlighted. But I think all of this violence is, again, I think you mentioned in your introduction, Ken, about the gun violence and mass shootings, and I think all of these are interlinked. I mean, as of today, there have been 299 mass shootings in the US. And the uptick has been going up. I mean, some of the local incidents that were being discussed earlier fall into that category. And, in 2021, mainstream media did start giving some attention to gun violence, but unfortunately, they often tiptoe around or simply fail to acknowledge the racism at play in shootings where people of color are more often than not targeted by white assailants. And this pattern of seeking to blame shootings committed by white men on mental illness continues. I mean, despite a lot of pushback from independent outlets, from politicians, from active citizens. The coverage is so lopsided and so biased that often it does not educate and inform the public about the real crisis that gun shootings pose. And, the key difference between, but then of course, independent outlets have been trying to report, outlets like Truth Out, Democracy Now!, Common Dreams, The Nation, etc. They have been trying to report on the connections between increased rates of mass shooting and the overall American obsession with gun culture. So Salon, for example, quoted many political scientists and had a title which says it all: gun crazy. For too many Americans, guns are tied to masculinity, patriotism, and white power. But we also need to, and this is the last part, I know I'm taking a little more time than allocated, we do have to factor in how mass shootings, gun violence, and the overall incidence of violence is also linked to misogyny and domestic violence among many attackers. So, for example, Mother Jones, this independent outlet, did a study of 22 shooters, and their analysis showed, this was late 2019, I think, their analysis showed that 86% of those mass shooters had a history of domestic abuse, 50% specifically targeted women, and 32% had a history of stalking and harassment. And these particular interlinkages then play out, domestic abuse, misogyny, this obsession with gun culture, and the fact that mainstream media does plays very, very minimal role in educating the public or informing them on what a threat it poses to America. And I think the issue of white nationalists, terrorists, whatever threat has already been highlighted by the speakers. But currently that is what the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, in their testimonies have already highlighted. And if you were to dig deeper, you would find all these issues of both structural racism, white supremacist narratives, ownership of guns, misogyny, kind of interlinked, and they keep on manifesting them in acts of random and brutal violence. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank all of you for your incisive comments. We would like to now open up the for a question and answer period, and to take questions from our audience viewing this event through YouTube. And we will, please submit your questions through the chat function on YouTube in that regard. One of the things as we wait for people to respond, several things sort of emerged from the comments that I heard, and feel free to, respond to any one of these. I think one, I think about what Travis said about, highlighting the fact that this issue of violence is not a youth problem. There's, so often been the tendency of critique of the younger generation. We saw this play out certainly in the 1960s and in subsequent generations as, whoever was the demographic sort of emerging into young adulthood, that there was something wrong with them because they did not adhere to what had been, the norm, so to speak. But that this is not necessarily this is not a generational issue. I think what Sabrina said about structural violence and really highlighting that violence is more than just physical violence. But there is the reality of structural violence. And as a ethics professor who taught me in divinity school said, structure relationships. And I think that a lot of the ways in which that has structured violence of various sorts of structured relationships that create advantage and disadvantage is something to take into consideration. I think too that, as Richard indicated, we have to also look at context. We have to look and we, in the context, can determine how we can make the approaches necessary to undermine what violence we do see. But also too, to be clear about who the actors are and who the actors are not. Excuse me. And then finally, Rumi, as you talked about, Raza, that, narratives are important. And that, language shapes reality. And the question is, what kind of reality is being shaped? And so, I'd welcome your responses to that. And then we've got a couple of questions or comments in the chat that we will forward to you.
I mean, part of this work has to do.
Travis is not hearing you real clearly.
Reframing what health. I think part of this is reframing what healthy men's masculinity looks like. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of young people who are brought up in this toxic understanding of what masculinity is and what you have to do to prove yourself, what you have to do to demonstrate, what type of a young man you are. And so, a lot of work around healthy men's masculinity is directly related to reducing violence against women, right? And so we do have more and more young people being taught what masculinity looks like, unfortunately, by music and media, and that leads.
Richard.
Yeah, I want to just mention a couple of things because it looks like separate parts, but it's not separate, right? Our perception of violence and how violence is acted out and performed are discursively produced within the context of America's racial history, right? The way we see it and the way we respond to it. And right now we're hearing a lot of people, a lot of politicians in particular, stepping back from any forward movement that we made on police reforms. It doesn't look like the George Floyd Act justice is not gonna. It looks like it's not gonna pass. And what we see though is a ratcheting of more police practices and the talk about it. And there's a narrative on the police side. Their narrative is that because of last year's demonstrations and call for police reform and the fact that everybody seemed to be on board with that, it has demoralized the police. And the police are therefore not doing their job like they're supposed to be doing, or not wanting to do their job. So if that argument is followed through logically, it seems like they're contributing to the uptick on crime because they're not policing the way they're not doing their jobs, you know what I mean? Because they're demoralized. And at the same time, they're asking to have more funding for policing. It seems like the idea of police reform or the idea that the police can act without violating the civil rights of individuals and do effective policing are mutually exclusive. I don't think these ideas are mutually exclusive. I think policing could do policing the way it does as guardians to the community and still protect the civil rights of our citizens. So they don't have to go beat the crap like the Professor Raza says of anybody and not do effective policing. So the narratives are just conflicting and misinforming the population or the audience that is targeted to. And that's how we're going to end up back with a tough on crime philosophy, and we're going to incarcerate more people, and everything that happened in the 80s and 90s is going to happen over again. But we have to keep fighting. We have to keep fighting for reform. We have to protect the civil rights of our citizens, and we have to pass the George Floyd Act. Seriously.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Other comments?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to add, today President Biden just announced that his, the response to this uptick in crime is is more police officers and authorized the local and state packages to be able to, for the cities and counties and states to be able to use those to hire more police officers. So the pendulum is swinging away from 2020 to 2021 in the opposite direction. And I think that could be demoralizing itself to the many activists that were really involved in, so much effort in getting the reforms and other things in place, both at the city, state, and county and national level. And I hope that's not the case, but it takes a vigilant watch on the part of civil society to make sure that we don't swing too much the other way. But I do fear that might happen, especially because of this narrative that we're seeing popping up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Raza, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, I think the key issue, fundamental issue that is relevant both at the national level as well as the local, the Ithaca cases, has to do with police reform. And, the various sort of, the call for police reform intensified last year. Then we saw some movement forward, and then, there's a one step forward, there are two steps back. And that's something that needs to be really reimagined. And, even when you look at the media here, local media, save a few outlets, you would often see that the police sources are quoted. Their view is taken as sacrosanct as the truth, quote unquote. And that is where the problem sort of occurs, because a lot of communities or individuals or whose voice may not get out or does not get to the readers or viewers. That is what needs to be highlighted by a more sort of responsible media reporting and narratives. But I think I come from a country which is still governed by a colonial police order. I'm from Pakistan, and across South Asia, the 1861 colonial police order is in force. And it's been, 150 years now? And if you look at the origins of the current policing system in the US as well, it is very much reminiscent, and a lot of work, a lot of research and studies have shown that it is still designed against people, people of color. It is to keep them pushed back, as threats, black and brown bodies, somehow. And yes, there's been tinkering and there have been local changes, but I think that until that is not reimagined and refashioned, we will not be able to wholly tackle the issue of violence.
Yeah. Thank you. Question has come through the chat. And it's this: does trauma at the individual level contribute to occurrences of violence? If so, what types of trauma have been identified as highly contributing factors to societal and individual violence?
Trauma? That's what we're talking about here, right? When we talk about these settler colonial formations that still operate among Black and brown people in our communities, we're talking about trauma. We were interviewing, when we were doing the reimagining public safety committees, focus groups, one young lady, in an exhausted voice, she said, being Black is a hard job. And prior to concluding that, with that statement, she described how her family has been harassed by police, how her father was in jail, how her brother was arrested multiple times, how they live in poverty, and how they had to be hustling when they were younger. And it shouldn't be. And these are histories of trauma. I have not met anybody in the encampments or anybody that's at risk or anybody that's really suffering from mental health issues and substance abuse and poverty who does not have a history of trauma. Racism itself is traumatic. Being excluded, being dehumanized, being marked as different just because of what W.D. Bois called hair, skin, and bones is problematic. And that's trauma. So trauma does inform the way we understand how this violence acts out in our community. So, at least for me, I guess.
Other responses?
I'll let you go first, Reza, this time.
No, I fully agree with Richard. I think, there's a lot of, lots more and more evidence points towards how the role of trauma in sort of perpetuation of cyclical violence patterns. But at the same time, I would say that I would go a step further, that what do we have to counter or address that in our communities? So in a lot of places, both in the US and across the world, there are so few opportunities for communities and families that have undergone traumatic incidents, and it's basically a matter of public policy and how far local and national and intermediate states are committed to addressing this issue. The link is there. It's very much established. I'll just stop here and let Dr. Karim weigh in, who knows far better than me on this issue.
No, not at all. I think we're all experts of trauma in different ways through personal experience. So, but I will just say a couple things. So this is an area where there's been quite a significant amount of research, political science research, internationally and globally, trying to understand how people who have been victims of political violence or civil war, civil conflict, how that violence affects them individually and how that affects them at the society level. And actually, I think the standard assumption is that there's this idea that violence begets more violence. And actually, consistently across many different countries, the opposite is true. So people that experience violence and trauma actually become more politically active and more pro-social. Because they want to seek out collective healing and seek out policy solutions and seek, redress grievances as opposed to becoming more violent. And I think that kind of research finding is really important because it really goes against this kind of violence begets more violence idea, which is reiterated in the media. And the other point that I wanted to say is, I think the other thing that the news has been reporting about is these random acts of violence that are happening at grocery stores, on airplanes, and et cetera. Interestingly, there's no racial assumptions based off of they're mostly all white people, but so there's no interesting. The narrative is very different, right? Is what I'm trying to say. But one of the best explanations that I've kind of heard or read about is that. I talked about this idea of collective amnesia about what happened on January 6th and, the election, but also, we haven't as a society been able to grieve about the last year and, over 600,000 people dying, which is a pretty big deal. The mortality rate in the US last year was the same as around World War II. So the fact that there has been no grieving process collectively or as a society, I think is really going to have some kind of impact, and we're starting to see that potentially some of that is violent. It doesn't have to be, but I think the fact that we just have this kind of idea that we just move on to the next stage without really thinking about what has happened or processed it could be really harmful.
I think about some of these young folks and the anger that they carry with them. Whether it's related to things that have happened within their family structure, maybe not knowing their father, is the images that they've seen now, through social media. When I was younger, when Richard was younger, you too, Dr. Clarke, we didn't see videos of Black men being killed 2 or 3 times a week, right?
That's right.
Are watching this on a regular basis. This is what they see. And some of them don't have people to go to and talk to about what they see, or they're misguided by falsehood heroes that give them the wrong information and give them the wrong advice on how to deal with this. But how often have we stepped to a young brother and said, "Hey man, I want to talk to you about something," and they say, "Man, you're not my father. I don't have to listen. I don't even." So like there's this underlying anger with some young people, and then there's how they see themselves. If folks don't see their lives as being worth something, if they don't see their life as having value, then how do they view others that look like them? And that leads into some of it as well. And our mental health system is broken. It's been broken, and so some of these young folks, they actually need other services that they don't get. I think trauma plays a huge role in dealing with violence.
How can I agree more in terms of your response, Travis, as well as our other panelists? I mean, I think, one of the key things that was said was that, indeed, we have not had space to grieve per se over the pandemic itself, but also too, I mean, with regard to any number of factors. I mean, just, the realities of racism. I remember we had a program our office sponsored, after the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. And people in the conversation were really talking about just being just kind of fatigued. I mean, the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual, even the physical toll of racism exacts certain cost from us. And that, I mean, and it reminds me of two things. One of the, kind of creating that space for grief for oneself personally, if not collectively, but also the need to sometimes step back in order to step back in. I'm reminded of an old Bob Marley song. There's a line in it. The song is called The Heathen, but he talked about the one who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. And there's a lot of wisdom in that line. In terms of having to retreat in order to replenish and to get back. It's also related, I think, and I welcome your responses to this, to the reality that structural forms of violence, institutionalized forms of violence, are social determinants of health, and they impact vulnerable populations disproportionately. And that these are factors that we have to take into consideration in looking at the realities of violence and violence as being something more than just a physical act.
Fully agree with you.
I fully agree with you. And I want to state, as I don't know if you know my history, I served a lot of time in prison. I was convicted of a horrible crime when I was young. And I was raised in a violent environment, and I abhor violence. We want to state that for the record, that no one, I believe in this panel, or myself, approves of violence. Violence is just a terrible thing. And when it happens in our community, when I saw the video the other day of in New York City where this guy was shooting at the guy and there was kids around, I was just horrified. And it is bad. But we cannot have this Willie Horton effect because we have these crimes. And this is what's happening here. We paint whole communities, especially Black and brown communities. This is what we think about. You close your eyes and I tell you, listen, there's violence in the inner city community. And you think of a Black guy with a red bandana or a blue bandana around his head, or a young lady, it has a racialized component. And although we abhor violence, right, we should understand it for what it is. We should try to fix the problem. Incarcerating our way out of it, militarizing the police, going back to those systems that have failed over and over again, it's not going to solve our problems. We could be terrified, we could be horrified, but we must also be reasonable, rational, caring. I mean, there's human beings involved in all sizes, on all sizes, I would say. And I just want to put that out there, that we have to contextualize when these spikes happen and try to understand them instead of reflectively reacting to them and rationing up practices. I mean, the idea that in order to have good policing, we must beat the crap out of Black and brown bodies. It's not sustainable. It's not going to happen forever.
I agree. And the sociologist who I quoted in my introduction, Patrick Sharkey in his book Uneasy Peace, brings out, that, the sort of the complexity related to the decline in crime we saw in the 90s, but it came at the expense in many cases of a type of law enforcement that exacerbated tensions that already existed, while also having impact on crime. That it's really a complex thing that we have to deal with, and that it did not, and as a result of that, it's brought us to where we are now. It's directly related to the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements for social change, and that I think makes all the more clear the importance of reimagining what public safety is about.
So I'm sorry to jump in again, but this is a point that I have to point out. Ithaca's population is 4% Black. Now think of this number. You got 31,000 people in Ithaca, approximately. We have less than 5% of them are Black. That's like 1,500 people. They make up 50% of the local jail population consistently. 40 to 50% of the local jail population. Reimagining policing doesn't begin to describe what we must begin to do in order to have. This is Ithaca. This is a progressive, forward-thinking, enlightened community that's got more non-for-profits than they got actually homeless people. Homeless people. It's really a case study in absurdity. And we have 50% of the local jail population, Black and brown bodies. Men and women, indiscriminately. They don't discriminate when it comes to that. I worked with a case recently where a guy had a felony, a white person. They reduced it to a misdemeanor and told him to go to a drug program. He failed out of the drug program. They brought him back to court and put him in another drug program. And this time they told him, if you fail, we're going to send you to Willard, which is a 90-day drug program that he's going to graduate. It's mandatory that he graduates. Meanwhile, this Black kid doesn't even get the chance. These are two cases that I'm working with, that I worked with. I'm not going to tell the court not to put this other guy, to balance this stuff out, but this is just an example of how it plays out in this progressive, forward-thinking community. And it's problematic. And so reimagining policing doesn't begin to describe what we need to do here.
I agree with you. We're talking about two different systems as well. You have policing, then you have the judicial system. And so there's a lot more leeway in that system once somebody's in there and how you charge them and what's being recommended. But our drug court system is broken at best as well. You're telling people who obviously got arrested for involvement with drugs that it's more important for you to call us at 6:30 in the morning to find out if your color comes up to give a urine test than it is for you to get a job at the most employable hours of the day with the best transportation. These are people who need to be working. But we're saying it's more important for you to give a urine test randomly here and there than it is for you to be employed. And then we end up having people not be successful in the drug court program. And they say, well, we gave them an opportunity. They were looking at all these years in prison. We gave them an opportunity and they failed out of drug court, which is really not designed for you to be successful. I do know several people who intentionally violated to go to prison instead of being in drug court because they knew doing a 6 month to a year bid would get them through it faster. So, we have several different systems. Policing is one of them, then the judicial system. And then Ithaca, like Richard said, Ithaca is program rich. There's a million programs, but from the county level down, they're not all designed to meet the client's need. Many of them are designed to meet the needs of the people that work in them. You look at mental health services, people are not having mental health crises only from Monday from 8:30, Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 4:30. That's not just the hours that people have crises. Most people don't have crises. And mental health service is not designed to go to where people are at. It's designed to set up appointments for people to come to them. So when I think about the work that Richard's done, Tammy's done, what Lead will do, these programs are designed to go to the people because that's where they're the most vulnerable, not relying on people to come to them. So a lot of what we're talking about also comes down to the way services are planned and rendered in this community.
Yeah, I want to clarify something. When I think of policing and courts and mental health and DSS, I think of them as disciplinary systems all together. And so it's sort of juridical systems that work towards producing these subjectivities of criminal and non-criminal, good and bad, acceptable, unacceptable, worthy of life, worthy of death. So for me, it works. It operates in a continuum track. For me, that's what, and it's problematic in all areas, right, including the drug court.
I feel you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank each of you for contributing to a very robust and informative and important conversation. Really a full-throated analysis of violence locally and violence nationally. I want to thank each of you for your contributions to this and hopefully, what you've shared will, indeed be taken into consideration and will be acted upon where we live as well as in other places as well. So again, thank you all very much for your participation, and we will officially end this event and say to our audience, thank you for participating as well. And we hope to see you for our next program event, which in fact is tomorrow, in which we will be hosting a Pride Month event called LGBTQ plus Resiliency in the Age of COVID from noon to 1 on this same channel. So we'll see you hopefully again on tomorrow. Thanks for